The self is a labyrinth of mirrors pieced together by one's own perception. It is a statue sculpted by the gaze of others. The more we live, the more we blur its outlines, and the more we are trapped in the shadow of a dissimilar self. This dissimilation germinates in secret at the moment when we see ourselves reflected as strangers somehow. Seeing oneself as an other is an act of reconstructing the world. Slipping into the cracks of the everyday, questioning the known and exploring the unknown, it is not mere detachment, but expansion. The dissimilated self releases the cage of restrictions and opens up the boundaries where all possibilities intersect. Perhaps loss of self is the discovery of versatility. It is the sensation of an inner motivation seeping out into the outside world. It is the brilliance of the moment when action coincides with intention and leaves its mark on the world. However, finding a sense of efficacy in the dissimilated self requires a new perspective. By blurring the contours of the self, its efficacy extends beyond the confines of a single individual, as if it were a ripple. The self is no longer fixed, but functions as a connection point with others. To dissimilate oneself is to gain a broader perspective, which is the key to releasing power beyond the self. Within the dissimilated self, one is not alone. That sense of isolation paradoxically evokes a resonance with the other. A sense of efficacy comes from feeling oneself as an other. It is the rapture of breaking through the narrow shell of the individual and immersing oneself in a resonance that transcends boundaries. The dissimilated self is not just a loss, but a door to the universalization of efficacy. It is a path to reaffirming the self beyond the self, its existence as part of a network of possibilities. It is in the vortex of dissimilation that the seeds of true efficacy are sown, and these seeds grow into a vast forest that covers the world. When the transparent breath refuses to call the self self, what dwells in the void is the reincarnation of affect. The catabolized mirror reflects silently, and the reflection is that of a being that has lost its outline, and the answer has already dissipated to the outside. The loss of the self is not a vulnerability of the individual, but rather a sign of an ethereal expansion floating on the horizon of consciousness. The myriad pixels projected onto others are coarse particles that enhance a low-resolution consciousness. Walking the periphery of the dissimilated self is nothing more than an act of rewriting the ground beneath one's feet each time. Just as a traveler without a map creates his own path with each step, a sense of efficacy is the unpredictable joy that arises at the end of this rewriting. To fix the self is to confine the senses. Heterogenization is the key to opening the world. And in this heterogenization, being generic means that existence transcends individual boundaries and begins an endless communion. When the self forgets to be the self and scatters within the world itself, we finally know how to freely manipulate our sense of efficacy. This sense is the truth of existence as an intersection, a myriad of threads strung between self and other, subject and object. The image that sways in the distorted mirror, too far and too close to be called me, the self, dissimilated before it is understood as self, is a strange being that is no longer self, but not other. Its existence takes shape only at the moment when the boundary between the world and the ego becomes blurred. What we call a sense of efficacy is the response of touching the world, or it is the reverberation of the illusion of having moved the world. The sense of efficacy is released in the vulnerable existence observed from outside the ego. It no longer needs to keep turning as a cog to maintain itself. It is playful, unrestrained, even aimless. When the self is dissimilated, efficacy becomes generic. It flows beyond the framework of definition and into a place of no use. I am not me, I am not the other. I float around as an acting being. Dissimilation does not mean isolation. The reflection in the mirror is not me, but the more I try to deny it, the clearer its outline becomes. But dissimilation does not necessarily remain in the negative. The divided self is pregnant with the possibility of new perspectives. It is precisely because the self is incomplete that a gap toward the world is created, and the possibility hidden in that gap is transformed into universality in the name of efficacy. It is an act that goes beyond mere personal accomplishment and fosters the power to resonate with the world. When the dissimilated self dismantles the I unit and becomes part of a larger collective consciousness, a sense of efficacy becomes a medium for bearing the pain of others and sharing their joy